Share screen. Hold on a second, though. Mess this up. Okay, how's that? Am I sharing screen? Are you seeing the lecture? Excellent. All right. Well, welcome everybody to 11. I hope the reading wasn't too confusing. We're going to go through it now. So, and I encourage you to really ask me questions if you've got any, not just pretend, but to really ask me. As I say, this is important to me. So I do like it when I know that you're okay with it. You've got your midterm back, and I've returned your midterm with, with comments for each of you, individual comments. But if you have any other questions, just let me know. I'm happy to respond to any questions. It's probably easier if you just contact me at my email rather than the school email or D2L rather. So today we're going to do chapters 2 and 3, and I have a PowerPoint for you, and then our next reading post and activity. So the first thing that I want to say is it's super important to listen to the sound files. I don't know if any of you have started listening to them yet. You can't download them because they're copyrighted material on Michigan. But if you go to your page 2 of the book and just literally go to their website, they're all sitting there. So you can see them. They're all in a list like this on that website, and you just click on it and you'll hear the sound file. So it's worth having that window open when you're reading the book. It's extremely important that you do that, because then you'll be able to hear some of these patterns. You won't have to sort of make them up for yourself. The idea is that you can connect these patterns to real speech. So I really want you to do that. I know with the first book we had, there was a CD. I don't even have a CD on my computer anymore. So that's one of the reasons we put it up on the website for Michigan. Every time there's a sound file to go with something, there's a little ear icon. And the voices that you'll hear, if you haven't listened yet, are mine and the newsreader broadcaster from KTR, which is our local PBS station. So you might recognize his voice. He's got a lovely, lovely voice. So he opened his radio booth for me to do this, because he is actually a previous alum of ours. He was thinking of doing TESOL for a while. He still might, but he's still currently at the radio station. But anyway, so each chapter there's a number of sound files. In chapter 2 there's 5, in chapter 3 there's 10, and you'll see the little SF and the number, and we'll listen to a couple of them today to get you used to how that works. Okay, so let's start with chapter 2. So chapter 2 gives you an initial overview of the model itself. Okay, so the easiest thing to do with a new model like this, just like you do with syntax, and you have nouns in one category, verbs in another, is to say, okay, to break it into the separate pieces. So in this model, there are 4 separate systems. Okay, they're very clearly delineated. The first system is how we divide the speech stream into units. Oh, someone wants to come in. The second system is highlighting prominent information, so stressed material within a speech unit. The third one is choosing the pitch pattern on the tonic syllable, which means either rising or falling. And the last one is choosing pitch height. So that has to do with the pitch range of your voice as opposed to the rising and falling. So those are the 4 systems that the primitives, so the intonational primitives, the things that the model relies on, break down into. So if you can sort of keep those, and then the chapters take one of those at a time. So chapter 2 is the overview of all of them. And then each of the rest of the chapters for the next 5 chapters takes one at a time. So today we'll be looking at the overview in chapter 2. And then in chapter 3, we look at dividing the speech into units, the first system, okay? So dividing the speech into units, transcription, you've got the transcription symbols at the front of your book, but I've redone them here. So that means a unit boundary, right? And those of you that have been teaching for a while, these are the same things that pedagogical books call thought groups, tone groups, intonation units. They're all the same idea. They might be defined differently in terms of how they're put together, but they're essentially the same idea. And the idea is that they have an equivalent function to sentences and clauses in written language, right? That they divide an idea from another idea, right? So they usually match semantic or syntactic chunks of language. So that might be one piece of information, a single question, a single clause, subject plus a predicate, a division of complex clauses, independent and dependent, either together or separated, items in a list, separations of things like adjuncts. So however, so that would be a separate unit. So there's no rules here. None of this stuff goes by rules in the sense that you have to do one thing or you have to do another. It goes by the idea of conventionalized norms. There might be more than one way to do something, but there's also definitely a way that you would never do it. And that's how come we know the difference. That's how come we know that there are norms. Because if someone violates that norms or that convention, you say, well, I would never do it like that. So let's give you an example. All this is from your chapter. This is a boundary exercise. So this is a reading or a short paragraph. Last time I was at an airport, I was between planes and I had to make an important phone call. I looked around and all the phones were busy, so I waited in line and waited and waited. Finally, I began to listen to the conversation of the guy who was talking on the phone I was waiting to use. All right, so I just did that and practically lost all my breath. So how would we divide that if we were going to divide it? Well, there's a couple of possibilities of what we were likely, native speakers, American English are likely to do. One is divide it this way. Last time I was at an airport, I was between planes and I had to make an important phone call. I looked around and all the phones were busy. So I waited in line and waited and waited. Finally, I began to listen to the conversation of the guy who was talking on the phone I was waiting to use, right? That's one. It's sort of dividing it by basically simple syntactic clauses and single semantic things. The second version takes much longer chunks, right? In this case, this person is putting much longer chunks together. Last time I was in an airport, I was between planes and I had to make an important phone call. I looked around and all the phones were busy. So I waited in line and waited and waited. Finally, I began to listen to the conversation of the guy who was talking on the phone I was waiting to use, okay? So what you have here is 2 possibilities. Both of those are equally fine, right? Both of them take different semantic and syntactic chunks. In the first one, you're dividing into much smaller clauses or units. And in the second one, you have larger clauses or units, but it still makes semantic and syntactic sense, right? Just highlighter. So, the decision lies with the speaker, right, as to where the boundary is going to occur. But as a listener, we expect that boundary to occur in connection with the semantics and the syntax, right? So the intonation choices are united with the syntax and the semantic choices. How do we know that? Well, we can have an idea of how we know that there's ways that we wouldn't do it if we listen to what it's like when those norms are violated. All right, so I want you to listen to this. This is an Indian English speaker.
Last time I was at an airport. I was between planes and I had to make an important phone call. I looked around and all the phones were busy. So I waited in line and waited and waited. And finally I began to listen to the conversation of the guy who was talking on the phone I was waiting to use.
Okay, so what can you tell me about that one? Does that sound like something you would expect a Northern American English speaker to use?
No, I don't think so.
Good. And why not, Aaliyah? What strikes you as some of the things that are wrong, that sound not right about that?
Hopefully I'm phrasing this correctly. So some of her speech felt segmented between words instead of phrases.
Good. Yep, you are doing a fantastic job. Thank you. So where I have these bold, and finally I began to listen to the conversation of the guy who was talking on the phone I was waiting to use, okay? These are not divisions that we would typically see, right? In fact, it turns out that Indian English does divide units in quite a different way than British English and American English. So we can see, and we'll look at some of those differences in later chapters. But the reason we know that this sounds normal is because we know that this doesn't sound normal. Okay, so we can go by the fact that as we normally unite intonation, semantic and syntactic boundaries, what the problem here is that we're not doing that. She's dividing semantic and syntactic boundaries and dividing the intonation units from them, and that's the problem. So what happens is when you have to listen to a speaker that does this for a long period of time, it gets quite difficult to sort out the information structure, actually. All right, so that's system number one. So the first thing that you want to think about is how the speech, so speech is just one long blur, right? So the first thing we've got to do is work out what the conventions or norms are in how you divide up units, and we'll look at that again in chapter 3. The second system looks at highlighting prominent information, and we talked about this a little bit before. So there's a distinction between prominence and lexical stress, right? So prominence is utterance or sentence stress, and lexical stress is word stress. So every word has a lexical stress. So if you take a word like mother, the lexical stress is on the first syllable, right? Mother. But when you stick mother into a sentence, it may or may not have prominence, right? So my mother did say I could go, right? In that case, the prominence, the sentence stress is not on mother, it's on did, right? So even though there's lexical stresses everywhere, mother did say I could go, the only prominence, utterance prominence, is on did. My mother did say I could go, right? So not all syllables that receive lexical stress are going to receive prominence. And this is really important because this is one of the biggest problems with beginner and low intermediate learners. They have lots and lots of stresses in a sentence. And because they have so many stresses, it's hard to hear the important prominences, right? So if you have a sentence like this one, what I want to do today is give you an overview of women and work. What we actually have marked in the first is all the lexical stresses. What I wanna do today is give you an overview of women and work, okay? That's all the lexical stresses. So if we had citation forms of these words in a dictionary, that's where all the lexical stresses would fall, right? But when you put it into a piece of discourse, you're just trying to focus on the important information. And that means that you're only going to have a few stresses on whatever the speaker thinks is important. So here's a version of what that might sound like.
What I want to do today is give you an overview of women and work.
Okay, I'm going to play that again for you.
What I want to do today is give you an overview of women and work.
So all those lexical stresses have been reduced to just a few prominences on what the speaker thinks is the important information that the listener needs. So what I want to do today is give you an overview of women and work, okay? Because that's the important information. And you don't want to lose that in lots of other individual stresses, right? You want to keep that prominence. So how many prominence does a tone unit have? Well, it depends, right? Depends on how much important information is in the unit, right? So the more important information there is in the unit, the more likely you are to have more prominences, okay? That said, typically, you can think of a tone unit structure in English as comprising about 3 to 7 words. So that's usually how many words we have in one go, and containing 1 or 2 prominences within that unit. Okay, now that's just a sort of standard. Things that are unlikely to be made prominent are things that the hearer thinks the speaker, that the speaker thinks the hearer will already understand. Things like pronouns, contractions, articles, and so on. That said, if a pronoun is a particularly important piece of new information, then that can be stressed, right? I said, she did it, is the prominence in that utterance. Because in this case, even though it's a pronoun, the important information is that it was her and not somebody else, right? The important information is the contrast. But if we go back to here, for example, what I want to do today is give you an overview of women and work. In this case, you've got 3 in this one because he's making an announcement of what the new information is. And in this one, you've just got 1. As I say, useful starting place is to think of it as 3 to 7 words containing 1 or 2 prominences. Okay. All right. So that's system number 2. I know we're zapping through these, and remember, each chapter is going to come back and take a specific look at one of these systems again. System number 3 out of 4 is choosing the pitch pattern on the tonic syllable. So again, those of you that have some familiarity with teaching pronunciation or phonology this is often called the focus word. It's sometimes called the nuclear stress. It's sometimes called the tonic. It's always the final prominent syllable in the tone unit, and it stands out from the rest because it's usually longer, louder, and carries pitch movement either up or down or level. It says I've got a thing here, but I can't think of what's on here. Hold on a second.
What I want to do today is give you an overview of women and work. What I want to do today is give you an overview of women and work.
So I should have actually put in this transcription, but this transcription is on page it's on page 24, and what you'll see is it's the tone choices that go with those 2 units. So what I want to do today is give you an overview of women and work. So the first one goes up, second one goes down. Have a listen again.
What I want to do today is give you an overview of women and work.
So hopefully you'll be able to hear that. What makes you choose either a rising tone or a falling tone? Rising tones are usually organized by understanding what the speaker thinks the listener knows already. So if you use a rising tone, it's associated with known or old information. And if you use a falling tone, it's associated with new information. So this is one of the reasons, for example, that the gravy example was such a problem. You remember the gravy example we did with the Indian women last week? Thanks, Sarah. So the gravy example was, one of the problems was they said gravy, okay? And you can see now why it's a problem if you associate new information with a falling tone. It sounds like you're being told something that you know already. Like British English hearers know that it's gravy. They don't need to be told that it's gravy. What they want is to be offered it, like as a polite suggestion. So gravy, which would be glossed meaning the pragmatic meaning, as something like, here of course is gravy. Would you like some? As opposed to that gravy, which is glossed as, this is gravy. Take some, don't take some, I don't care, right? So this is part of the reason why that was such a problem, because even though we don't consciously know what we're thinking with falling tones or rising tones, we do know how they fit into our norms of the intonation structure. So it's like when someone says gravy, you say, yeah, okay, I know it's gravy. I don't need to be told that. So what's the point, right? So you can imagine that as something like this. This is something that we pulled up before when we were talking about old and new information. So this is the speaker and all the information the speaker has. And this is the hearer and all the information the hearer has. And this is all the information that the speaker and hearer assume they share together, right? So this could be a little bit if you don't know each other very well. So for example, if I'm talking to somebody in the store, not that I go to the store anymore, but let's say I was talking to someone in the store and we started talking about the election, I would assume that that's in here, right? Because I can't imagine anybody in America right now who doesn't know that we've got an election tomorrow, right? So even though I don't know this person, this is not a person that's known to me, I can still assume that this information is in known information. Now, if I know this person really well, the bigger this middle part becomes, right? I can assume that there's lots of information that me as a speaker would share with Sal, my husband, as a hearer, right? This becomes much, much bigger. So it totally depends on the speaker's perception of what the hearer knows or doesn't know. So if the speaker thinks it's new information to the hearer, they'll use predominantly falling tones. We know this in classroom discourse. Classroom discourse is made up of predominantly falling tones. That's because there's a lot of new information being given by the teacher. If the hearer hears falling tones, they expect new information, right? If it's old information, information that's assumed to be known, then both speaker will use and hearer will expect to hear rising tones. This is a very broad concept. For example, if we go back to what I want to do today is give you an overview of women and work. This idea of what I want to do today, this rising tone here, is because we all know it's today, right? We're all here. We're all here. It's all today. It's known information. We're all here for that reason, right? Then here comes the new information. The speaker is about to tell the students, this is classroom discourse. The speaker is about to tell the students what he's going to talk about today. What we're going to talk about today is an overview of women and work. New information to the hearer, because this is the beginning of a lecture. Hearer hears that as new information. Does anyone have any questions at this point, or does that make some kind of sense?
I have a question, and
yes, thank you, Sarah.
It may only semi-relate, but I'm just thinking to what I'm teaching right now in class, and I teach native English speakers. I just have a regular language arts class, but we're currently learning about the Holocaust and reading Anne Frank's diary. So a lot of, and when we're done with our lesson, I'm going to end up going back and listening to my own lessons to hear what kids say. But I noticed that a lot of when I'm kind of talking through it, I'm saying things like, you know, right, and Hitler was in charge of this Nazi party, and I'm raising it because it's something that they don't know a whole lot about. So when they then return the speech to reiterate something or restate something that they know, because it's considered known, would we expect falling tones from them? Or because it's still kind of new to them, does that make sense?
It totally does, and you're previewing something that's going to come up in the Rising Falling Tones chapter, because you've spotted something that's very important. What research shows us is that effective teaching often is part of a teacher pretending that students know this stuff already. So using rising tones, because they want it to appear more familiar. So they'll say like, so Hitler was in charge of the Nazi party. And then, because your instinct when someone says that is to go, right? And this is one way in which teachers express to students, don't worry about this. This is all known information. This is all easy. Don't panic. Don't. And in fact, my dissertation was on exactly this. So what I found was that American English speakers, these were TAs, teaching assistants, teaching chemistry, would say things like, so you remember potassium was purple and sulfur was orange? And then the students would go, right? And then the Chinese TAs would say, you remember potassium was purple. You remember sulfur, sodium was orange. Now, there's no syntactic reason why you should use either a falling or a rising. You can do both. They're both equally grammatical. You remember potassium was purple versus you remember potassium was purple. The difference is when the teacher says you remember potassium was purple, there's this integration, right? Yeah, I remember. Yeah, this is good. This is clear. This is everything. So what you've hit on is a strategy that many speakers use to bring the speaker and hearer closer together. So to increase this middle bit and to make you, so what you're trying to do with your students is basically bring the both of you closer together. So they feel more integrated into the discourse. Does that make sense? So there's going to be a whole thing on that in chapter 4. So when you get there, you'll say, aha, I intuited this. So you're exactly correct. Yeah. Nice job, sir. All right. So now, and of course, this new and old information, as I say, it's a very broad concept. So for example, if I'm in a town I don't know, and I ask someone for directions, then the person giving me directions is going to assume that they're giving me new information. So they're not going to, unless they've got Valley Girl talk and they all talk going upwards, they're not going to say, so around the corner there's a bridge, and that bridge, you go, you know, they're going to say, so around the corner there's a bridge. And when you go on that bridge, you're going to turn left off the bridge, right? Because they're going to assume they're giving you new information because you've asked them where to go, okay? So all these pragmatic assumptions between speaker and hearer come into intonational choice and drive intonational choice, which is why it's called a pragmatic model. And it has to be a contextualized model because it totally depends who the speaker is, who the hearer is, what the norms. There's norms and conventions, but how those norms are used depends on the particular context. I will say one thing, Sarah, and everybody else, once you start doing this for a while, you start listening to yourself and it gets very distracting. So you start going, did I just say that with a rising tone or a falling tone? Or you say something and then you're like, oh, wow, why did I say that like that? Oh, yeah, because of that. It gets super distracting, actually.
I fully expect to overanalyze everything I say in class for the next couple of weeks.
Oh, God, it's awful. When I was doing this for my dissertation, when I was doing this for my dissertation, I was analyzing speech for about 9 months. And every time I went anywhere, didn't matter whether it was the pub or the class and whatever, I was just like, oh, listen to that rising tone. That's a great example. Or, you know, it was just, oh, yeah, it drives you kind of crazy. But it's good. It's good. So there's 5, you might remember back on this slide, there's 5 tones altogether. There's 2 types of rising ones, and we'll look at that later. One's a rise, one's a fall rise. And there's 2 types of falling. One's a straight fall, one's a rise fall. We'll look at that later. And the 5th one is a level tone. And when I say level tone, it's a sustained tone. So instead of it's or instead of well, so it's well, so, okay, so you can hear this sustained movement even though it's flat. And we use that for slightly different things. We tend to use that for anything that's routinized language. Now, for me, I grew up Church of England, and well, when I went to church at all, which wasn't very often, and we all had to say the Lord's Prayer. So, well, actually, we also had to say it at school as well. So this is how we used to say the Lord's Prayer at school. Dear Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. It was all like, whoa, because we weren't actually talking to anyone. Or at least I didn't think I was talking to anyone. I was just like repeating this routinized utterance. And this happens we tend to use the level tone for this. That happens in the classroom a lot too. You'll hear things like, stop writing, put your pens down, turn your paper over. You know, it's all sort of routinized language. We tend to use it with fillers like or we also tend to use it with mitigators for pragmatic purposes. So, you know, if I said to my sister, if my sister said to me, so what do you think of this skirt, this new skirt she got? And I said, well, that's a warning sign. That means watch it, because I'm probably gonna, you know, you might not like what's coming up next. Okay, so sometimes we use a slight rise on that tone too, so it'd be, well, but it's a warning, and we recognize it as that. If you say well or so, and it's that kind of context, people hear it as an alarm bell, that they're not necessarily going to hear what they want to hear. This is particularly true in the classroom. Teachers will often do this. They'll ask a student for an answer, and the student will give them an answer, and they'll say, uh-huh. And that's like, that means that's so wrong. And the student knows that's so wrong. You know, you don't have to say, well, that's wrong. You just go, well, and the student's like, oops, blew it. So, so that's the fifth tone. We are going to go back over all those tone choices in more detail in later chapters, including everything Sarah said about rising tones, which is awesome. And now we're going to look at the last system, the fourth system in the model. And this one is the one that usually people have no experience with. Even if you've been teaching and you've been working with pronunciation textbooks for a while, people often don't have much experience with this. And this is pitch range. So it's a choice of whether you're high in your range, mid in your range, or low in your range. So it's still a pitch measurement, but instead of movement, the tone choices were pitch movement measurements, up, down, or long. This is height, where you are in terms of am I high, am I mid, am I low? And it turns out if you talk to people for any length of time, or if you know somebody well, you get a very strong sense of what their pitch range is. Obviously different people have different pitch ranges, but part of getting to know someone and talking to them is learning how they tend to divide their pitch range. Now, of course, it depends, because little children have higher overall pitch ranges. Women have medium pitch ranges, and men tend to have lower pitch ranges, all to do with the vocal tract usually. But there are also some sociocultural uses of pitch range. So, for example, did we talk about this already, Anne? Japanese women and sociocultural uses of pitch. Did we discuss that or?
I don't think we talked about that, but I was just thinking that.
Okay, so why don't you explain to the others what I mean by that? So that the use of a deliberately higher pitch range.
Well, I don't, I just noticed it from my own watching of TVs and shows where the Japanese women, or even Taiwanese or Korean, women tend to raise their voices to sound really cute. They want to sound like a young child. I don't know. I can't do it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. It's a sociocultural use of pitch, and it's interesting. I talk about it later in the book, because there are some learners of Japanese, particularly older female learners of Japanese, who object to this strongly, who see this as, rather than a pragmatic feature, see this as them basically having to pretend that they're like, a little girl, rather than, so they refuse to do it. So it's a very interesting kind of concept, because for Japanese women, it just is what it is. It's a pragmatic part of speaking Japanese in certain contexts. But sorry, yeah?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Eri, I forgot you were there. I'm sorry. Hello.
No, I just wanted to say something, because people say I speak much higher pitch when I speak Japanese.
Excellent. I forgot you were sitting there, Eri. My apologies. So tell us about this. Tell us about how this.
Well, I just sometimes, like my American friends, if they happen to hear me speaking Japanese, your tone pitch becomes much higher. They say that. So I'm not doing anything intentionally, but I obviously, when I switch between English and Japanese, and I speak much higher. Higher. Right.
Now, the question is, Eri, do you know any learners of Japanese who've told you that they don't like doing that? Female learners of Japanese who've ever said anything to you about that?
No, I don't know. I never discussed.
Interesting. Yeah.
Dr. Oh, go ahead, Anne. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, my last trip to Taiwan, I noticed men speaking that way as well. It wasn't just limited to women.
Oh, interesting. I might have to do a second edition of the book, Anne, because I've pinpointed women for that. Aaliyah, yeah.
Oh, well, to speak on the Japanese learners who, I guess, reject the higher pitch, I had some colleagues from my undergraduate years. They became English teachers and moved to Japan. And for whatever reason, they've noticed that certain male colleagues, people who are native to Japan and people who are non-native, it's almost like it escalates certain issues. So when she actually began to use the higher pitch, she noticed that it was almost like a de-escalation technique for her in conversation. And she's like, I hate this, but it works.
That's so awesome, because that's exactly everything that the research suggests. Yeah. Yeah, this is great. This is everything that, so that has to do with sociocultural. It has nothing to do with physiology, right? Physiology will change overall by biological sex and age, obviously with massive variations in between. But sociocultural variation is an entirely different thing. Now, there's some interesting, not much, but some interesting research on gay gendered speech as well, where there's a particularly famous guy, Ron Butters, who's done quite a lot with this, who also says that pitch is used in gay speech by some speakers, as a gay male speech specifically, as a sociocultural marker. So that's actually not anything I've read a little bit about it, but it's sort of super interesting that pitch is being used in this way on top of the conventionalized norms of the way that we use pitch. But I'm delighted to hear that the research isn't making all that up, because I haven't actually been to Japan, so I'm just relying on other people's research on that. So assuming no sociocultural differences, and assuming normal physiology, what you're going to get is a pitch, speaker's pitch range that it can essentially roughly divided into high, mid, and low. Now, you might get extra high, you might get extra low, but essentially for most conversational speech, you're going to have those three. And we can look at this through something like a simple IRF pattern. Now, an IRF pattern means basic classroom interaction, initiation, response, feedback, interaction. So this is very common in the classroom, where the teacher asks a question. It's not a real question. The teacher's asking if the kids know the answer. A student gives the answer, and then the teacher says whether it's yes or no, or correct or incorrect, right? So this is a standard IRF pattern. Teacher says, what's the final answer? Student says 12. Teacher says 12. Good. Okay, that's the end. That's the end of the interaction. So that's no markup is the first version. So it's just the orthography. There's no prosodic or intonation markup. The second markup that you see there is for units. So how that would fall into units. What's the final answer? 12. 12, good, okay. And then the final markup on there is tone choice. So what's the final answer? 12. Or the student could say 12, and the teacher says 12, good, okay. So if the student says 12, that means they think they know, okay? That's information, and they think they know. If the student says 12, they're saying, can you please confirm to me that I'm correct, that the answer is in fact 12, okay? And we can hear those here.
What's the final answer?
12.
12, good. What's the final answer?
12.
12, good.
Okay, So you hear those differences. Again, one of the big points that I want to, and I know I keep saying this over and over again, but you can hear that these choices aren't about grammar, okay? You can have, it doesn't matter grammatically whether you say 12 or 12. There's no syntactic reason why you have to say either. It's a pragmatic choice, depending upon what the speaker is trying to communicate. So we can add to that a final markup, which is key and termination, which is this, this either it's going to be high at the front and end, mid or low. And again, we're going to come back to this system with a whole chapter, but when we mark it up, you essentially, for something like an IRF interaction, spend the whole time in a mid key, because a mid key is the neutral pitch range, okay? And then finally, the low key finishes the interaction, okay? And that in an IRF interaction will always be the teacher. It's the teacher's job to finish the interaction. It would be too cheeky for the student to finish the interaction, right? So if the teacher said, what's the final answer? The student said 12. Teacher's like, yeah, okay. But it would normally be mid. What's the final answer? 12, 12, good. Finish, close the interaction in terms of pitch range.
What's the final answer?
12.
12, good.
Okay. Does that make some kind of sense? So far, you're with me, Sarah, who was very worried about this.
Termination just the final key, or what's?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
Okay.
That's exactly what it is. It's the one that appears on the tonic syllable at the end. That's exactly what it is. So that's your 4 systems. That's the 4 systems that the model comprises. And you can see them right here. So this is the discourse pragmatic model of intonation. It says that everything that we do with intonation can be included in one of these 4 systems: prominence, tone, key, and termination. There's 13 choices, okay? So as you look back over these chapters, as you go back, if you start getting confused, please go back to chapter 2, because the idea is that it takes you through each piece at a time and says there's 4 pieces, and those are the 4 pieces that you need to understand, okay? Some of them may be more intuitive to you than others. Units, for example, what makes a unit versus pitch range, but they're all equal. Okay, so I want to make a couple of notes on the last 2 parts of the chapter before we move to chapter 3. 2.5 in your chapter is called competing models. This is literally only for anyone out there who has a lot of experience with intonation as a reader and is thinking to themselves as they're looking at this model of Brazel's, what about this other model that I heard of and that I've used called the auto segmental metrical model. This is a very common model for researchers to use in America. It's a competing model to Brazel's model. If you know that model and you're thinking, well, why has Lucy chosen this one, Brazel's one, and not this one, the auto segmental model, this is a good thing for you to read, this little section right here, 2.5, because it will give you the answer to that question. If you have never looked at an intonation model in your life, never heard of auto segmental metrical model, don't even worry about it. Just skip the whole thing. It doesn't matter, okay? But then you do want to go ahead and read 2.6 and 2.7, because they'll take you through the reasons why you know, having a discourse intonation model is good and so on. Okay. But don't get hung up on 2.5. It's only if you've got questions about why we're using this model and not this other model. But if you've had no experience with either model, it really doesn't matter. Okay, so any questions or clarifications I can give for this one? All right, then in that case, let's take a deep breath and look at chapter 3. Now, chapter 2, I went over in great detail. Chapter 3, I'm not going to go over in so much detail. You can read it yourselves. But I want you to, in chapter 2, I wanted you to get an idea of, make sure you had an idea of the 4 systems. In chapter 3, I think I've only done 4 or 5 sound files on this PowerPoint. There are 10 in total. So there's tons more examples for you as you read through the textbook. And chapter 3 gives you our look into the first system, right? Dividing speech into units. So if we go back up here, we have these 4 systems. And this is the first one, dividing speech into units, is chapter 3, okay? Probably the most straightforward one in terms of just thinking about how we speak, right? So the difference, although there's a lot of parallels between dividing writing into sentences and dividing speech into units, there's also a lot of differences, because speech doesn't have a grammatical necessity to be anything other than a single word or sound, right? So a unit, a single unit, could be something as simple as that's it. That's a tone unit, because it's a single unit and it has a long, sustained, flat tone, right? So there's no grammatical requirement that a unit in speech have a subject, have a predicate, all the things that you require for writing in terms of clauses and sentences. So a speech unit can be tons of different things. It can be a single sound like it could be a single word like dude. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Dude, Where Is My Car? Dude, where's our car, or something. There's a whole conversation in Dude, Where's Our Car, where they just are saying dude. He's like, dude, 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 dude. And they have this entire conversation that it's all about the semantic ways in which they say dude. So dude could be one. Another one could be, let's take a look at the book. That's one that we might say in the classroom. This I've taken from the speech that President Obama gave when he opened the Martin Luther King Memorial in Junior Memorial. He gave a speech, and these are the units that he divided his speech into. I have the first beginning part. I have 2 daughters aged 5 and 8. And when I see the plans for this memorial, I think about what it will be like when I first bring them here upon the memorial's completion. So what you have here is the whole range that you can have. And it totally depends on context, it depends on message, it depends on formality, and so on. Okay, so it's not you don't have to have a subject and a predicate or anything like that. It can be any of those things, can be a single unit. So how do we define a unit? We do it by pitch and prominence, just as we talked about. So if you have a unit, what Sarah just said, for example, she said, is termination the final key? She's absolutely right. That's the one that appears on the tonic. And then the key is the one that appears at the beginning of the unit. So you've got key is first prominence, tonic syllable is final prominence. So if you look at a small tone unit, and this is called a tonic segment. So this is a small tone unit with 2 prominent syllables. Draw the graph, okay? Here's your key. Here's a little mini unaccented syllable in the middle. And then here's your tonic, which in this case, I used the phonetic. Draw the graph. Draw the graph, okay? But you can also have optional bits in the beginning and in the end that are not part of the tonic segment. Okay, so you can draw the graph now. You can draw the graph now. Okay, the two ones that I highlighted are the tonic segment. Okay, don't worry too much about that at the moment if you're beginning to start to panic. Tonic segment isn't anything you really need to, the point just is that you're looking for those, typically those 1 or 2 prominences per unit. And the end one will carry that falling or rising or level tone. And the beginning one will carry that high, mid, or low range. Okay, so what do we do when we're picking prominence out? So let's have a look at highlighting new information. So A says, I need to borrow some money. So B says, how much money, right? The prominence, in this case, is only 1 in the unit, and it shifts from the old information, money, to the new information, much, right? And it's going to sound like this.
I need to borrow some money.
How much money?
Okay, you can hear the shift because you don't want to say money, you don't want to say how much money because we already said money. But that's a really good way to practice what it might sound like if you did it the wrong way. Okay, so this would be the wrong way. I need to borrow some money. How much money? I need to borrow some money. How much money? Okay, and the reason it sounds weird, and I'll show you here what it sounds like.
I need to borrow some money.
How much money?
The reason it sounds weird is because we already said money once. So the issue is not that you want to borrow money. The issue is how much money you want to borrow. So prominence signals that new information. Here's another one. We use it for establishing contrast. So let's say you're going out and you think it's going to rain. And you say, did you want to take the small umbrella? And your husband says, no, the golf umbrella. Okay, by that I mean the golf umbrellas are a huge umbrella, right? Now, if you want to hear how weird that sounds if you do it in the wrong place, if you just put it all on old, if you put it all on old information, you get something like this. Do you want to take the small umbrella? No, the golf umbrella. Do you want to take the small umbrella? No, the golf umbrella. Do you hear how strange that sounds? That's because you're not highlighting the important information. In this case, the important information is the difference between golf umbrella and small umbrella, right? And so the pitch prominence follows that important information. That's where your focus word is, right? If you just have it on the end both times, that is not your focus word. Now, what's super interesting about this, and we'll come back to this in chapter 6 or 7, is that there are some varieties of English that do this. This is called heavy end stress. And in some new Englishes in Asia, they do this. They, instead of putting the pitch on the contrast, they just shift it all the way to the end, regardless of whether there's a contrast or not. So we'll have a look at that a little bit later, but it can be one of the reasons that new Englishes are difficult for traditional English speakers to understand because of shifts like that occur. Did anyone have a question? Sarah, your little light's on. Did you have a question? Or Aaliyah?
Maybe this is me being paranoid, but it's almost like when the emphasis is put on the word golf, it feels like the speaker emphasized the word for clarification. But at the second example, when the stress was put on the same word, it almost felt like, to me, I mean, I know there's they're not trying to be condescending, but it's almost like that's what I'm feeling. Is that weird?
Well, no, because in fact, this is one of the reasons why speakers of New Englishes often suffer something called the linguistic penalty, where Americans or British people say, what the hell's wrong with you? Why are you trying to confuse me so much?
I feel bad.
Yeah,
oh my goodness.
It's rough. It's rough because if you're from, this is Malaysian English, particularly this happens in, where they will shift it to what they call this heavy end stress. So even though the important information is in the contrast, it gets shifted away from the contrast. So did you want the small umbrella? No, the golf umbrella, right? A speaker of traditional English says, why are you trying to confuse me? Why are you making my life so difficult? I don't understand what you're trying to say. Why don't you focus on the important part, which is the type of umbrella, not the fact that they're both umbrellas, right? And so you're absolutely right, Aaliyah. What happens is people have emotional responses to this. This is actually called listener irritation. There was a woman, Miriam Einstein, who did a lot of research on what she called listener irritation, and that's what this comes down. And listener irritation is when the listener says, what is going on? Why did they just say that in such a weird way, and now I'm having to pass it backwards to understand what that means? Like, why don't they just say it in a way that I can understand? That's called listener irritation. It's a real problem. It can be a real problem for speakers of New Englishes, particularly because they don't hear. It's not like you're a learner. So it's not like you're coming into English with nothing, right? You can just follow the traditional English's rules. You're coming into English with a variety of English that you're perfectly happy speaking, that you've spoken all your life. But now all of a sudden, when you're speaking to a speaker of traditional Englishes, they're like, why are you making my life so difficult? So yes, that's good. What you're struggling with is what's called, or what you're hearing, you're intuiting is what Eisenstein called listener irritation. Oh, my lights just went funky. Oh, hold on a second. Lights just went. Sorry, I suddenly had strobe lighting in my office. Okay, so good. All right. Yeah.
For me, the dialogue just doesn't sound authentic in that I wouldn't repeat the word umbrella. I would probably say, no, the golf won, like use a pronoun or some replacement.
Yes. Yeah. And that's entirely likely. That is in fact what probably would happen. No, the golf one is probably what you would say. Some of the examples that we're going to look at for heavy end stress work more like this. So I'm sort of getting way ahead of ourselves here, but I think in chapter, it's in, where are we? Chapter 6 or chapter 7? Yes, so heavy end stress in some of the new varieties of English is more like this. It repeats the word. So one of the examples I have here is, where did you go yesterday? I went to the cinema yesterday. And that is actually an example from Malaysian English. So they did do that repeat thing. That's sort of what's happening here. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Well, and the reason that's absolutely correct, Anne, is because why would you repeat umbrella? What's the point in repeating umbrella? It's not the new information, it's the old information, right? Good. Mm-hmm. All right, so that's prominence. The next one is pause. Now, people intuitively think that in pause is what divides units, right? And most of the time they do go together, right? That what you expect is you get prominence, falling, rising tone, flat tone, pause, next unit, okay? but it sort of depends on the discourse genre itself, right? Some you have heavy pausing. So if we go back to example, the one up here with Obama's speech, there was heavy pausing in there, right? I have 2 daughters aged 5 and 8. When I see, so he's reading a script, essentially has what's called rhetorical or pauses or dramatic longer pauses. But in conversational speech, you can have far fewer pauses, particularly if you have a teenager. They often just go with virtually no pauses whatsoever. There is a website, and you can find this. I've put the website in the book. That's called Motor Mouth Interrupt, and basically it's a website that teaches you how to keep talking without pausing at all. Oh my God, did you see that? I don't know if you're going to go out tonight, but I really want to. With no pauses whatsoever. So pause doesn't necessarily operate as a boundary marker with pitch. You can also think of sales calls. This is, it drives me crazy. When someone starts talking and they'll say, hello, Mrs. Pickering, how are you today? So today I want to and they don't give you time to answer, and they deliberately don't give you time to answer because they don't want you to say anything, and they don't want you to hang up. And if they pause, you might hang up. But we've basically been taught, if someone's talking, you don't interrupt them, and you certainly don't cut them off. So I've had to learn over the years, I don't know how many of you can do this or do this as much as I do, but if they start and they say, hello, Mrs. Pickering, this is the roofing person from da-da-da, and we would like to talk to you about, and I would just hang up. Because I know what they're doing to me. They're playing me. They're not giving me an opportunity to answer them, because they're not pausing between their units. They're deliberately playing me. They think if they keep talking, I won't hang up on them because I won't get off the phone. How many of the rest of you will hang up on someone if they keep, not your family, obviously, but sales calls? Will people hang up, or do you just wait until they shut up for a second and then you interrupt them?
I know my husband will hang up, but I usually just listen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I either hang up or I cut them off and say, no, thank you, and then click off. As soon as they go into a spiel, I'm just, no, bye.
Good. Yeah, right. But Leah's much more common, I think. I mean, and I have to say, it's also more female reaction, according to the research, too. It's more gendered, that women will keep listening longer than men will. So I've really had to teach myself. I'm like, don't feel bad. They're playing you. They've been trained to play you. They know that you feel bad if you just hang up, but you've just got to do it. Yeah.
You have to tell them to take the phone number off of the phone list, otherwise they keep calling you. So.
Yeah, we've tried that. I don't know how they keep getting my numbers. They've now even got my cell number. That drives me crazy. Now, generally speaking, I won't pick up the phone, because if I do pick up, until I know who it is or whatever. But the point is that training is done deliberately. They are trained because they say, if you keep going, it's going to make them uncomfortable to hang up. So just keep going. Don't wait for them to respond, or, my most favorite one, most recent one is, what's that guy say? He comes on and he says, well, hello, Lucy, you're about as difficult to get to as the last pickle in the jar. Ha, ha, ha. Now let's talk about, and I'm like, oh my God. So that is a combination of, like, let's pretend you're talking to your grandma and, or your friend, and not stopping, at the same time. It's very interesting. So all that by way of saying that pausing and intonation choices often go together in terms of unit boundaries, but don't necessarily always go together. Okay, so we define units by pitch, not by pause. Okay. The last thing we're going to talk about is the rhythm of speech. And again, for those of you who have more experience with pronunciation teaching, with phonology textbook, pronunciation textbooks, this might sound more or less familiar. So if you're less familiar with it, don't worry. If you're more familiar with it, this is the idea of stress timing versus syllable timing, which is very common in English teaching literature. And what it says is that if you're a stress timed language, like traditional English, British or American or Canadian English, it's different from if you're a syllable timed language, such as Italian or Spanish. Okay, so syllable timed languages, the idea is that all syllables are roughly the same length. So da 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 da. And the idea of stress timing is that syllable length depends on stress. So da 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 da, as opposed to da 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 da, right? Interestingly, New Englishes, Singapore, Malaysia, are more on the equal length side than the stress length side. It's another very big difference between them and traditional Englishes. Anyway, although this is frequently discussed, it's important not to go too far down this road, because what you end up with is something that can be produced, what's called a teacher-induced error, which is basically producing unnatural rhythms in English. So a lot of stress is taught often through nursery rhymes, poems, gives you a very sing-song kind of quality. So you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink, right? Or another kind of nursery rhyme. Jack and Jill went down the hill to go to fetch the water, you know, this kind of thing. And in fact, we don't talk that way. So if you keep teaching and using only those, like there are whole books of poems and nursery rhymes to teach EFL, ESL rhythm. And you want to be careful how often you use those, because they are in fact unnatural rhythms. And it's one of the reasons that you can end up having beginning and low intermediate learners stressing too much because the da 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 da, when in fact we're more like da 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 da. Okay, the pattern that we tend to have is this. It's called a suspension bridge contour pattern, and it matches this idea of key on one end, so prominent key on one end, and a tonic termination on the other end. So da 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 da. Okay, not da 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 da, or da 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 da, but da 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 da. Some examples of that. I really like the movie. It's the first thing we did in the class. Do you know what street it's on? All those are very typical suspension bridge contours, right? So in other words, the point of this is that most of our units are made up of this kind of pattern. So if you have a learner that's stressing every single word, you lose this kind of pattern, and it's this kind of pattern that carries the important information. Richard Caldwell, whose work that you had a look at earlier this semester, did a lot of research on this, found that almost 90% of tone units, so almost 90% of units in American English or British English, contained one or two prominences. So they looked exactly like this or like the okay, so instead of the they went do da and had a big one at the end, but almost 90%. Okay. There were less than 5% of the time, there were multiple prominences per unit. Da, 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 da. So in other words, if you're Jack and Jill go down the hill, doesn't exist. This is not a spontaneous conversational rhythm that you will find inside speech. Okay, it's a rhythm that's marked for poems and nursery rhymes. If you have a stress time speaker, a speaker that's really having problems, then I'm not saying don't use poems, songs, and nursery rhymes, but that is also not, if you overuse that, you're also creating an unnatural rhythm in your students. And the problem with that is that the important information is carried in these two peaks, these key and this termination peak. So if the listener can't follow that information structure, they're going to have a hard time. The last thing we're going to talk about is pedagogical implications. That's the last part of every chapter that's about one of these systems. And basically what it does is sum up what we know about the research with regard to this issue. So this issue with regard to units, so building speech units and learners, what we have found over time is that beginner and low intermediate learners suffer with short tone units with multiple prominences. So pretty much like, for example, that Indian speaker we heard where she was dividing very short units and multiple prominences. Why is that a problem? Because it makes it hard to spot this pattern. Okay, we're actually, as listeners, we're listening for the key and the termination. So we're listening for the focus word. If you've got multiple prominences, multiple utterance level stresses inside a single unit, it makes it very hard to listen to that for that. We also know that beginning and low intermediate learners have erratic pause patterns. So their pause placement and their pause lengths can also break up this melodic contour that's inside a unit. And that also makes it much more difficult for listeners to follow the information structure. Finally, and this goes with the idea of multiple prominences, if you have a learner that's doing lots of prominences inside a single unit, it makes it very unnatural and very difficult for the listener to hear the overall information structure. Because remember, the listener is following the steps. The listener is trying to follow one important part of the utterance prominence to another one, because they're assuming that you are making prominent just the new important information, okay? If you start making everything prominent, new information, old information, then it becomes much, much more difficult to work out what the information structure is. And this, in turn, means that you have to go back and think about it and say, wait, what was the important bit here? This gives you cognitive problems in tracking what's happening in the spoken discourse. Remember, it comes and it goes. It's not like writing. You can't go back over it. And it also makes you annoyed. And this is what Eisenstein talked about with listener irritation. She said it's a double whammy. You're getting annoyed because you can't understand. And part of the reason you can't understand is because cognitively you're having to go backwards to keep rethinking what that information structure was. So in general, what we want to do that's sort of a little bit different from what you might see in pedagogical materials that you're using now or that you have used is you want to avoid too many unnatural rhythms. So you don't want to spend your whole time working on nursery rhymes and proverbs and songs and things where you create this rhythm that's in fact part of the problem. Da, 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 da. You want to avoid that. You also want to avoid comments that you hear a lot and you see a lot in pedagogical pronunciation, which is comments like stress content words, but don't stress function words. So function words would be things like conjunctions, pronouns, you know, but content words would be adjectives, verbs, nouns. And then you have a learner who's thinking every time they have a content word, every adjective, every noun, every verb, they're supposed to stress it. Well, then you get this problem. You get this multiple prominence problem where you can't work out what the important information is, because we don't stress every content word. In an utterance, we stress the content words, we give prominence to the content words that are the important information. But that's not all the content words that are in the utterance. There might be a lot of content words that are not stressed. Does that make sense? Yeah, lots of nodding. Thank you, nodders. I really like it. I really like nodders. Any questions, clarifications, or comments on any of that?
One question. Is this the difficulty in understanding only when it's between traditional English speakers and new English speakers? Can new English speakers understand other new English speakers?
Oh, excellent question. Yes, new English speakers can understand other new English speakers quite happily. Yeah, because everybody's working with heavy end stress. Yeah. It's very interesting. It is also true, though, that, for example, if you have a speaker in Hong Kong who is used to British English, for example, as it used to be, they will probably struggle with a heavily Malaysian English speaker. So it really depends on what your familiarity is with what model. So it's not so much geographic, it won't necessarily be geographic. It will be what your familiarity is with any given model. For example, a lot of speakers from other parts of Asia find Indian English speakers difficult because they're not used to the pan-Indian features that Indian English might have, you know, even though they're both new Englishes. But yes, a lot of the times they do. Traditional English speakers have, you know, part of the problem with intonation and traditional English speakers is that we assume that everybody must do it that way, because why wouldn't you, right? So you just said, for example, well, that's weird. Why would you say the golf umbrella, not the small? You know, why wouldn't you just say the golf one, right? Because that sort of makes intuitive sense, right? But in fact, all these things are, they're not logic. They're just the way in which the system has developed in one variety as opposed to another. It seems like logic, right? You seem like this is crazy. This seems unlogical, but in fact, it doesn't work that way at all. That's not how it works. You guys have excellent questions today. Anybody else got any?
Back to the first example of the Indian speaker talking about tone unit boundaries. I assume she's reading some text that has no.
Yeah, and you're right. That was a bit naughty, having an example where she's reading text. Yeah,
okay, because that's not her natural speech.
Well, okay, so yes, right. Okay, so Anne is calling me out quite rightly on the fact that I'm pretending that read speech is exactly the same as conversational speech. No, it isn't. You're absolutely right. However, it was the best example I had to go, and it does happen in spoken Indian English. They do divide the units in a much different way than American or British people divide units. So they have much smaller units. Now, I've given you some examples later on in the book of those smaller units, but this Madhari speaker is the best example I have of how it might sound. But you're absolutely right. It's a cheat. Yeah. It's a little bit of a cheat, Anne. Yeah. Damn it, you found me out.
I have a question, Dr. Pickering.
All right.
Those patterns we see in New English, are they a reflection of their first language?
It seems to be. I mean, this is an empirical question that is being. New English is much more interesting to people now than they ever used to be. So this is an empirical question that's currently being investigated. So, for example, Indian English, a lot of people are looking at the difference between South Indian speakers and North Indian speakers and how that impacts their English accent, you know, their Indian English accent. So there seems to be a sort of middle ground. There are pan-Indian features that seem to come regardless of your L1, whether it's a Southern Indian language or Hindi or Urdu. And there are other features that sort of ride on top, depending upon if your Bengali is a first language or Hindi is a first language or one of the Southern Indians languages. So it's a bit of a combination of both. So I couldn't put this example in the book because I couldn't find a way to do it. But one of the best, well, I tried to write it and my editor said that makes no sense. But one of the best examples, as per usual, of my life as a person studying language is my husband. And at one point he said to me, I remember when I found out how I was supposed to speak English. And he was a teenager and he'd come to stay in London and with his aunt or some family member or other. And he suddenly realized, he said, I realized that I spoke it like that. And I suddenly realized when I was listening to everyone that I had to go, like, just instead of like, I had to go, and put everything at the end. You know, I had to have this big focus word at the end. And he said, and after that, I got it. I got the change in rhythm. So it was pretty funny. Anyway, I tried to find out a way to sort of say that in the book, but it was too, yeah, I couldn't work it out. But it was by far the best example I've ever heard of somebody working out that their first language rhythm wasn't working, and there was a second language rhythm that you had to try and imagine. And what he'd really worked out was this sort of suspension pattern, particularly with this high focus word at the end. So I always thought that was kind of awesome. All right, so for your homework today, we have reading post 10. So all this stuff now is coming out of the book. Answers questions 2.81 and 2, complete activity 2, and activity 7, you've got exercises and activities from chapter 3. So anything that all makes sense to everybody? Okay, well, I encourage you, if you haven't had a chance to read these chapters properly, I encourage you now, everyone, to go back and reread them, because once you've sort of had a chance to hear it as well, it's easier, I think. Please, when you read through these chapters, do listen to these sound files, because if you don't listen to them, I'm not sure that you're necessarily hearing what the pattern is that we're trying to describe. So yeah, do just open that site and you can just click on it and it'll pop, the sound file just goes right away. Okay. All right, well, I am done. Thank you very much, everybody. If you want to talk to me about anything, stay on the line. Otherwise, thanks so much, and I will see you next Monday.
Bye.
Dr. Pickering.
Yes.